Hey everybody, my name's Heather Ressler and this is Paleo Kitchen Tips brought to you by cooking.paleo.com. A lot of people asking me a lot of questions about paleo cooking and baking, and I thought, you know what? Let's do a series of videos. Today, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite ingredients, which is, of course, cassava flour. Right here. Here's the cassava. There it is. Alright. You may or may not have heard of cassava before, but you've probably heard of tapioca. And turns out tapioca is actually the isolated starch of the cassava root or the yucca root. Now what cassava flour is just the cassava root, peeled, dehydrated, and ground up. An awesome flour that is great for paleo baking. It's nut-free, and it's grain-free, and it's coconut-free, and it's awesome. There's three main questions that I get asked about cassava flour on a regular basis. Can I substitute almond flour, tapioca flour, tiger nut flour, coconut flour, whatever flour you have in your brain for cassava flour? And you really can't. And the reason is because cassava flour it's kind of starchy and it has a little bit of fiber and it's just a pretty unique flour. So you wouldn't think about substituting almonds for potatoes in a recipe. So don't substitute almond flour for cassava flour. You also don't want to substitute tapioca starch for cassava flour because the tapioca starch is just the isolated starch, just like cornstarch. And you wouldn't substitute cornstarch for white flour in a recipe, and for the same reasons you wouldn't substitute any kind of ground up starch, arrowroot for cassava in a recipe because it's just going to make it totally gummy, it's totally going to mess it up. If it calls for cassava, pretty much have to use cassava. Can I substitute it for white flour in like normal recipes, normal bread recipes or cookie recipes or whatever kind of recipe? And the answer is yes and no and maybe and it depends. And let me explain that. So you can often substitute cassava flour for like a white flour in some recipes that are like cookies or like a quick bread or a muffin or even a pancake, something that isn't very finicky, it has some eggs, you just stir it together and cook it basically. And that's like, you can usually kind of substitute in there. It doesn't always work, but that's a good starting point. You can't substitute in really anything that requires yeast or rising or kneading. So like a yeast bread or a sandwich bread or a cinnamon roll or dinner roll. You really can't substitute because it doesn't have gluten. It doesn't have the gluten protein in there to kind of mesh everything together like this. I don't know what this is. There are a lot of yeast bread recipes out there using cassava flour. There's one on my blog. It's like a French bread recipe. I have a couple of roll recipes using cassava flour. I have a cinnamon roll recipe. I have a pizza recipe. So there's definitely a lot of options out there if you want to do the breads with. When I bake with it, it becomes gummy. And this is a very common question that I get. And it's usually when people are trying to like their own thing. Now, because cassava is fairly starchy, people tend to add too much. What happens is because you have so much starch in your recipe, it makes the end result too gummy. So the best way to fix this is just use a little less cassava flour than you think you need. And so like instead of a cup, do like 3/4 cup and just like decrease it a little bit. And I found that to really help with that issue. The only source of cassava flour that I use is Otto's Naturals brand cassava flour. You can go to ottosnaturals.com or click the link in the description to go to their website, and they have cassava flour, free shipping. It's awesome. Guys, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next week on Paleo Kitchen Tips. I can do this. Okay. Whoops. Get the cassava flour. Wow. There's about top 3. Wow, Heather. You may or may not have heard of cassava. I can't do it.